Well, good morning again. Good morning. Last week, we started looking ahead to Jesus' birth. And we're doing so this season, this year, by looking at Jesus' family tree. And we saw that Jesus' family tree is not a line of saviors, but instead a line of people who tell humanity's story of a need for a savior. And the first story of Jesus' family that we looked at was that of Tamar last week. And Tamar's story, as broken and as difficult as it is for us to work through, shows us humanity's need for a savior. Someone to finally bring justice into an unjust world. And this week, another woman from Jesus' family tree will show us humanity's need for a savior in a new way. Matthew 1, verse 5 says that Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rehab, 29 generations before Jesus. This morning, we will explore the story of Rehab. Would you hear the word of the Lord? Taken from Joshua chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. And then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies into Shittim. "Go, look over the land," he said, "especially Jericho." And so they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rehab and stayed there. And the king of Jericho was told, "Look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land." And so the king of Jericho sent this message to Rehab: "Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land." But the woman who had taken the 2 men and hidden them, she said, "Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they had come from. And at dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, they left. And I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly. You may catch up with them." But she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them under the stalks of flax that she had laid out on the roof. And so the men set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that leads to the fords of the Jordan. And as soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gates were shut. And before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, "I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in the country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. And when we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, this morning we're looking at Jesus' great, and there are about, I think, 26 in there, great grandmother, Rehab. And 29 generations before we see Emmanuel, God with us, Jesus. And we'll look at her story in 3 chapters. 3 chapters this morning. Her unexpected guess, the decision she had to make, and then lastly, how she points us to Jesus. So first chapter of Rahab's story is her unexpected guess. After 400 years, where we hear Israel's story, this is after Tamar, after the story we heard last week. 400 years, Israel is captive, enslaved in Egypt. And after that, they have 40 more years where they're wandering through the deserts, living in tents. And Israel had finally come, after all that time, they're returning to the land that God had promised to them. And they're on the shore with one toe in the water, of the River Jordan. And about 3 miles away from where Israel was encamped at the riverside was the city of Jericho. And Jericho, by this point, was well aware that Israel was coming. Let me put this into perspective. There were 600,000 men, it says, on the side of the river. And on top of that 600,000 men, more than 600,000, you have women and children, all their family members, men that didn't have families, men who weren't fighting. And so scholars estimate that there were about 2.5 million Israelites on the riverside. 2.5 Israelites. And what you have is a city in Jericho who can feel the march of 2.5 million feet just 3 miles away. And their commander, Joshua, he sent, of those 2.5 million, he sent 2 men to act as spies in Jericho to spy out the defenses of the city. And you'd think, based on sending in spies to see what defenses the city had, that Jericho was this great city. We kind of think of it like a Troy. And at the same time, let me put Jericho into perspective. Jericho was a proud city. It still is, but at the time it still was the oldest city on earth. Today, if you get soil samples from the very bottom of the well in Jericho, which I've sat right along the side of, if you go right down to the very bottom, all of the dating points to that we have civilization in Jericho back 11,000 years. It's an old city, a proud city, the first walled city in the ancient world. At this point, it was already 7,000 years and no one had conquered Jericho. And the only problem, though, again, I said I'd put Jericho into perspective, is that by this time, Jericho had a population of around 900. 900. So if you're thinking in context, this is about the size of New Richland. So 2.5 people, 3 miles marching on New Richland. Think of that. And the king won't let the city, this proud city, fall easily, not on his watch. And so upon hearing that some foreign-looking strange men were spotted in the city that day, he hears that they may have lodged on the outskirts of town, and so he goes to the woman's house on the outskirts of town, the woman named Rehab. And the king sends this message to Rehab. He says, "Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land." Again, think of the mayor of New Richland. I had to look it up. There is a mayor of New Richland. So think of the mayor of New Richland sends message to the woman who lives on the outskirts of town saying, "I know that there are spies in your house. I know that they're in there. There are only so many houses. And so send them out." Which brings us to chapter 2. The decision she had to make. For Rahab, her life is caught in the crossfire of an incredibly difficult decision. If she reveals the spies, it puts her life in danger. If she hides the spies, it puts her life in danger, because if she reveals the spies, her guests might kill her. But if she hides the spies, well, then her neighbors surely will. And so, with an impossible decision in front of her, she hides the spies and lies to the king. Verse 4 says that Rahab had taken the 2 men and hidden them. And she said, yes, the men came to me, but I didn't know where they had come from. In other words, yes, they were here, but please hear me when I say that I had no idea who I had in my house. She's trying to distance herself from any possible guilt here, being in the least powerful position between the three parties. Verse 5, Rahab continues, at dusk, when it was time to close the city gates, these two men, they left. And I don't know which way they went, but go after them quickly. You may catch up with them. Basically, even though they were a few feet on top of the roof above her, she tells the king's men that she thinks they went about that way. And so the king's men, they went off into the hills looking for the spies. And as they leave the city, this is one of my favorite notes of the whole passage. As they leave the city, it says that the city gates were barred shut, preparing for war. And no one could come into the city, but as far as Rahab is concerned, more importantly, no one could leave the city. Rahab became like a prisoner in her own hometown. Because unless Israel arrived quickly, the king's men would return, and they would know that she lied. And there was no turning back for Rahab. No turning back. Whatever her fate was going to be, it was as sealed as the gates. She had put everything on the line, her very own life on the line, and it's not until after all of this that we find out why. Verse 8 and forward says, before the spies laid down for the night, she went up on the roof and talked to them and said, I know that the Lord has given you this land and that a great fear of you has fallen on us. So that all who live in the country are melting in fear because of you. We've heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to all those cities east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. And when we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. Rahab, you have to remember, didn't grow up going to Sunday school. Her parents didn't know the name Yahweh. She didn't learn anything about God growing up. This is not something that she's pulling out from the recesses of her childhood. This is something that she's learning in real time here. Charles Spurgeon, when he preached this text, he says pretty comically that her family had no family pew in the church. This is an outsider who's learning about God for the very first time. But probably for the last month or so, the talk around town would have been all about this people that were marching west. Not an empire, not a great kingdom, or an army from some great city far off, but this was a wandering people finding their way home. And all the stories weren't about how great the people were, even though they were great in number. The stories were all about how great their God was, who was protecting them, watching over them. And every step of the way, God provided exactly what they needed. And every step of the way, if someone stood in the way, that God would protect them. And if Jericho, you've got to think from Rahab's perspective, if Jericho was just another stop on Israel's way home, then, my neighbors might want to fight, but I am willing to lay everything on the line, lay my life on the line, because I can see the greatness of your God, and I don't want to stand in front of him. In fact, all I'm going to do in the verses after this passage, please read them later. The verses after this passage say, I only have one condition, Rahab says, please just show me mercy. Just protect me and my family. Because I can see how great your God is, and I know who I am, and I know how powerless I am and how powerful he is. Just show me mercy. And over the next few chapters of Joshua, over and over again, the author, Joshua, is reminding the people that while they were getting ready to conquer Jericho, they were reminding themselves over and over again that Rahab would receive mercy. And once Jericho was in the middle of being conquered, all of the commanders said, well, you can do what you want to the city, but at the same time, if you're going to show mercy somewhere, please show mercy to this home because of her great faith. And after Jericho is conquered, it says that Rahab is received into the people of Israel, welcomed home, welcomed as one of them. And that's Rahab's story. It's simple. Rahab got her first glance of who God was. And she immediately decided, in the midst of a hard, a difficult, and impossible situation, she decided to put her life in his hands. And she was saved. And that is why the story of Rahab, as simple as it is echoed over and over and over again in the New Testament. Matthew 1, of course, puts Rahab right into the midst of Jesus' family tree, making sure that we don't forget her, that we don't dishonor her. James chapter 2 praises the faith of Rahab. In the great parade in Hebrews 11 of all the saints of old, all the saints of the Old Testament, praising their faith throughout all the generations, one of the people amongst David and Abraham and all the rest, one of the people that is most praised for their faith is Rahab. They echo Rahab's story over and over again, as simple as it is, because she points us to Jesus. She points us to Jesus. Just like every other member of Jesus' family tree, she points us in humanity's story for a need for a Savior. And I think she does that in two ways. This final chapter of her story, she points us to Jesus in two ways. First, Rahab, her story challenges our false gospels. Let me explain. There is one lie that permeates and sneaks around in every church and has since its beginning. And it is called good news. But it is a false gospel. It is the false gospel of the good person. The gospel of the good person says that if you are a good person, if you do enough good things, if enough people, usually this is the metric, if enough good people say that you are a good person, then it ensures that God must think so too. And that in turn, because God thinks you're a good person, because of all those people who think you're a good person, that God will have no choice. In fact, it would be his joy, his delight, because you're a good person, to love you and to save you. And that is a false gospel. Surely Rahab, over and over in the text, it reminds us of her profession. She did not have a clean record. And yet God was merciful to her. Not because it ever says that she turned away from what she was doing. At the same time, it's simply because she saw her first glimpse of who God is and admitted her need for what He has, her need for His mercy. That is the only dynamic we see in which she is well loved and shown mercy, in which she is saved. And that same pattern is exactly how God's love operates today. Not because we have spotless records, but because He sent someone who did to stand in our place. Again, Rahab's great 26 times over grandson. It's not because of our spotless record, it's because of his. Rahab's story of being saved by her faith alone, not by sacrifices or temple attendance or how much of the flax that she donated to put herself at the top of the tithing list. Her being saved by her faith alone challenges our instinct to take on a false gospel that all it takes to win God's love is to be a good person. And what it does is it points us away from that false gospel, and it points us back to Jesus, who promises to love anyone who simply in their sight of Him admits their need for Him. And the second way that Rahab points us to Jesus is that I think her story in particular gives us such a strong view of God's love. Such a strong view of God's love. Because some may have a hard time acknowledging Rahab as a hero. Again, Hebrews 11 doesn't have a hard time saying that she's one of the exemplars of faith from the Bible's history, the Bible's story. James doesn't have a hard time saying that Rahab is an example for our faith. Matthew doesn't have a hard time putting Rahab right in the middle of Jesus' family tree, saying we cannot forget her, we must celebrate her. And at the same time, sometimes it's hard to talk about Rahab. And some have different reasons. Some it's because she's an outsider. She's not an Israelite. She's an outsider from the very beginning. Some it's because what it looked like to live out her faith was telling a lie. And man, is that complicated. But mostly it's because of what she did for a living. It's because she was a prostitute. Let me give you a glimpse to close. To live a life like Rahab did in the ancient world was never by choice. Never by choice. This was not some kind of brazen independence. In Canaan, girls were sold off to pay a family debt. If the family incurred a debt that they couldn't possibly see themselves working their way out of, they would give away a daughter. And so you look at the story of Rahab in all of her pain, having been traded away to settle one of her father's bills, her own family disowning her, putting her on the outskirts of the city so that hopefully not too many people would have to pass by her. And that's when, in the midst of all of this, our passage comes into play. This is when God's grace came along into Rahab's life. She begins learning about God for the very first time, and she wasn't treated as some kind of second-class citizen. Joshua chapter 6 verse 25, explicitly says that Rahab lived among Israel as one of them, was honored among them, and lived with them to the day of that writing. She was treated as a daughter of God, not a God who traded her for debts, but a God who died for hers. And that is the same story for each and every one of us, that we've been welcomed into a family of God, one that he has crafted among people who could never deserve it. And he did so by paying our debts, by creating a table in which we remember what it was like for him to pay those debts. And in a moment, we're going to celebrate that meal together. If you have even the slightest knowledge, think Rahab, if even you have the slightest knowledge, the first glimpse of who God is, and you're aware of God's love for you, and all you know is that you need him, you are invited to this table. We are going to begin each time we celebrate